It's terrific. It's a terrific mystery that I've managed to unravel. I really believe it was my love for Brunelleschi, my love for my city, Florence, and for this monument.
Florence, Italy. Crowds of tourists besiege the doors of its cathedral. Millions of people come from all over the world to stand beneath a Renaissance dome and marvel.
It was very important for each city to show its strength, its power, its wealth. And they were very keen to have something which everybody else would look at with awe and wonder how on earth it was ever constructed.
These are still dimensions that are big and serious for any engineering enterprise. I mean, any engineer today would still have to seriously think, how would he go up 50 meters in the air? That's a feat anyway.
The dome of the cathedral was built nearly 600 years ago. It was one of the first great works of the Renaissance. It's an engineering masterpiece, bigger than any dome built before and completely new in its design. It's one of the most studied buildings on the planet, but still no one knows quite how it was built.
An enormous building like this is quite difficult to analyse. You can't dissect it as though it were a corpse, because a lot of its structure is actually buried inside, and nobody's going to demolish the dome in order to discover how it was constructed, and so there are some things we'll probably never know.
Its builder, Filippo Brunelleschi, was a shadowy figure, so secretive that no one has been able to uncover the inventions that made his dome possible, until now. A local architect believes he's cracked one of the great secrets of the Renaissance.
I truly love this monument. From being a child, I've always loved it, because for a real Florentine, it's the symbol of our city. Coming to know the mystery in which it is shrouded, which resisted the investigations of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Zimmerlis, I've allowed myself to be seduced. I've now been studying it for 27 years.
Massimo has worked for decades on a solitary obsession. Now he thinks he's found the answer, and he's ready to prove it. In a Florence park, half a mile from the real thing, Massimo is building his own dome. It's an exact scale model of Brunelleschi's original, an experiment in Renaissance engineering. Massimo believes that this will finally reveal the inventions of the greatest architect of the Renaissance.
Brunelleschi can be described in a few words. He's one of the greatest geniuses that humanity's ever had. He's one of the greatest geniuses of all time. He can't simply be defined as an architect or an engineer or even an artist, because in all fields he has touched the principal apexes of art and technology. Defining Brunelleschi in the Renaissance seems very easy for me, because the truth is that Brunelleschi is the Renaissance.
When work on the dome began in 1420, Brunelleschi was virtually unknown. 16 years later, the dome was complete, and its architect was a superstar.
Brunelleschi's career as an architect was in a very real sense launched by his high-profile involvement in this project and consolidated by its success.
And this was a project which took up really the major part of his career as an architect, and it undoubtedly made him the most famous and celebrated architect in Italy.
To think like Brunelleschi, Massimo had to forget the 20th century and become an engineer of the Renaissance. Brunelleschi had never revealed his methods. Massimo had to reinvent them from scratch. Apart from Brunelleschi's buildings, the past has left few clues to follow.
I have indirectly walked the road trodden by the great maestro, who, unlike many illustrious men of the time, was a very reserved person. He himself has left us nothing, not even a signature.
In a Florence church, a side chapel is covered with Renaissance frescoes. The scenes tell the story of St. Peter. Among groups of identifiable 15th century celebrities, we have the only contemporary portrait of Brunelleschi. Who was he? Why was he so secretive? And how did he come to build the dome?
His family background were well-to-do, well-placed Florentine family, but although very bright, he wasn't particularly interested in book learning and went instead to learn the craft of goldsmithing. He came relatively late to architecture. He was 40 when he began his major involvement in the dome.
The story of the dome began nearly a century before Brunelleschi was born. In 1296, the medieval city of Florence began to build a new cathedral. It was intended to become the grandest Gothic building in Europe. Florence was becoming a power to be reckoned with, and it wanted all the world to know it.
The city had come from one of many important towns to be one of the biggest and most prosperous towns in Italy. There was a lot of money around.
The wealthy Florentine guilds spent huge amounts of money on buildings and works of art. Soon Florence would no longer be medieval. It would be pioneering a new age, the Renaissance. This would be the city of Leonardo and Donatello, Michelangelo and Botticelli. Painting, sculpture, architecture and literature were all being reinvented. Florence was at the heart of a revolution that was felt right across Europe. The Renaissance wasn't only a movement in art. It changed everything, from religion and politics to technology and engineering. Massimo was exploring Renaissance engineering in one way, but what about the original dome? What could the cathedral reveal about the building methods of the past? Timothy Verdon, once a professional art historian, is now a priest. He's canon of Florence Cathedral and has studied the ways in which Christianity expressed itself in a piece of monumental engineering.
The vast vaulted bays of the nave of the Florence Cathedral express not only their love of Gothic forms, but above all their capacity to manipulate the technology of Gothic construction to create, in this case, 18-meter square vaulted spaces larger than those in any other European Gothic cathedral. As they reached the end of the nave, however, their dream grew larger. What they imagined was a space that could compete with the greatest spaces the history of world architecture knew. A domed space that would be like the dome of heaven itself. A vast space beneath which the human being could feel at one and the same time the smallness of his proportional relationship to God, the Creator, and the greatness of his own capacity to recreate, in human terms, a heaven like God's own heaven.
what strikes one is the huge confidence that the entire project represents. They began it probably without knowing how they were going to finish it. They knew what they wanted to achieve, but not how they were going to achieve it.
The shape and size of the planned dome had been decided. It was even imagined in a painting. But no one seems to have given a thought to how this fantasy was going to be built. After 100 years of construction, confidence turned to horror and then resignation. The grandest cathedral in all of Europe was impossible to finish.
The problem was that they had set themselves a task which, at the time that the Duomo was originally built, they had no way of solving. And for a long time, it was just a hole. There was no dome there at all.
Timothy Verdon knows every nook and cranny of the cathedral, from the narrow stairwell which runs between the walls of the dome, to secret passages which lead to the very heart of the building, to places that the tourists never see. Hidden above the nave, a timber roof spans the towering arches of the Gothic church. Here the dust lies just as it fell centuries ago, when the medieval masons constructed the vaults. But the dome would be twice as tall as the nave, enclosing a space that seemed impossible to span. Brunelleschi knew that the tried and tested methods of the Middle Ages had to change. But how?
Brunelleschi was virtually obsessed with the dome and really believed that only he could build it. At one point he says, "Io la veggo volta." I see it already covered with its dome. When they asked him how he would build it, he refused to tell them. At one point, the famous story is told that he invited everyone to bring an egg, and he said, "Anyone who can make the egg stand up straight on the marble table will understand my system." They all tried, it fell over. Brunelleschi finally took the egg, broke it. Really, what Vasari says in his life of Brunelleschi is he broke the ass of the egg on the edge of the table. Ruppe il culo all'uovo. The egg stood up straight. The others said, "We could have done that too." And Brunelleschi said, "Yes, and if I tell you my system, you'll be able to build the dome."
People don't believe him. They poke fun of him. They ask him to explain, and when he does, they don't understand the explanation. They demand models. But Brunelleschi wants to keep control of the whole situation. And so when he does present models, they very often have bits missing, or he leaves bits out so that he keeps the secret of exactly how the thing is going to be constructed, and nobody else can copy him.
But that didn't stop people from trying. A century after Brunelleschi, Michelangelo studied Florence Cathedral as he planned St. Peter's in Rome. A century later still, and Christopher Wren studied engravings of Brunelleschi's dome when he was building St. Paul's in London.
So anyway, here...
Look at this also.
Yeah.
Wow.
Architects and engineers are still inspired by Brunelleschi. Daniel Liebeskind is one of today's most radical architects, and Cecil Balmond, one of the world's top engineers. They're planning a new extension to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's called the Spiral. If they can build its apparently impossible walls, it'll be one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world.
I think the Spiral project is a whole new leap forward in taking what is traditional materials, but in a wholly new way, very much like Brunelleschi's dome did.
You have to enter a realm where you become naive, where you don't know how to do something. That's exactly what Brunelleschi did. He didn't enter a transparent space in which constructions of that sort were already made. He entered, as I do, as I think all creative architects, artists, enter a space of forgetting, unlearning. In the court, right? But then it rises all through here. This entire space. Yeah. Here is actually traversed by the building without any support. Now that will give you some sleepless nights. If you think that is actually the point is just over this ridge.
Into the void.
Into the Pirelli.
Up from there, spiraling off.
Into the void. Wonderful. When I came to see the dome, I had studied it in books. I had looked at pictures of the dome. I had looked at all the drawings of the dome, and I was interested in how it was made as a young architect or a student of architecture. But nothing was there to prepare me for the actual presence of the dome. It is a shock of the new, in some sense. It is the shock of something that has never existed, and that no drawing and no device could actually prepare us for its existence. I think that's the shock which it had then, it still has to us today.
I think one has to take a leap back into time and put yourself in the position of people who didn't know what the end of the story was going to be. This was a very similar experience to a lot of the medieval builders when they were pushing the limits of Gothic construction.
The massive vaults of Florence Cathedral had pushed the tried and tested methods of the Middle Ages to the limit. Each vault had been built using wooden templates called centering elements, which supported the stonework during construction and also guided the overall shape of the arches. But the vast dome needed a creative step, a leap of the imagination that the 15th century masons found impossible to take.
Their notion that they could do the same thing for the dome derived from the belief that they could in fact construct the same kind of wooden centering, shoring it up from below, scaffolding from 60 meters below, scaffolding 43 meters wide, a forest of scaffolding supporting a mountain of centering elements on which then hundreds and thousands of tons of brick and stone masonry would have to be laid. When they actually faced the real problems they would have to solve, they understood instinctively that the same system would not work.
But Brunelleschi was convinced he could do it, that somehow the massive curving walls could be made to rise without any support.
Brunelleschi had a kind of remarkable confidence. He says at one point before the commissioners of the cathedral that even as he begins the work, he knows he doesn't know everything he'll need to know to build it. He has certain ideas, but he'll have to work the others out as he goes. He is confident, though, he says, that since the church is dedicated to God and His Holy Mother, they will help him.
Brunelleschi began to build without knowing if his ideas would work. It was the gamble of his life, and he knew it. Brunelleschi had to be single-minded. To have any chance of success, he needed to invent new tools, new measurement systems, and new and radical working practices. Here was a man at odds with his workforce, telling experienced bricklayers how to mix their mortar, showing master masons how to cut their stone. Still unwilling or unable to explain his plans, Brunelleschi remained passionately focused. Whatever else happened, he had to keep his newly built walls from falling down.
We know that at a certain point, when the walls of his dome began to curve inward, when therefore the workmen's confidence that the normal structural stability was undermined by the curve toward the center, they refused to go out on the scaffolding. They felt it was certain to fall. Brunelleschi himself had to go out on the scaffolding, pull great weights behind him, walk up and down, jump to show them that the walls would in fact stay in place.
So just what did Brunelleschi do? In the stairwell of the dome, one piece of evidence is visible. The bricks are laid in an unusual pattern.
If you normally put brick upon brick, and if you just go up vertically, we all know that works. But if you start going on the slope, that's very difficult. And Brunelleschi came up with a brilliant idea of a herringbone pattern that it's common sense in a way, but it's the intuition of an engineer at work there, definitely.
Many previous investigations had used the herringbone brickwork to explain Brunelleschi's achievement. But for Massimo, it wasn't enough. How had the bricks been laid in such a complex pattern? And how had the shape of the dome been preserved without any scaffold to guide it? The maverick architect had struggled for years to arrive at a solution.
Effettivamente studiare un problema, un quesito.
Actually, studying a problem, such a difficult and complex question, will bring a person to the point where he's confronted by night after night of studies, which seem to pass in a few minutes. Brunelleschi, too, faced with the same problem, would certainly have done the same thing.
Avrà fatto la stessa cosa.
Did Massimo's obsession really bring him any closer to his goal? Faced with academic skeptics, he pressed on with his experiments. How had his hero actually built the dome?
The fact that Brunelleschi was able to do this without using centering was what seems to have struck his contemporaries as the greatest part of the achievement.
Like the original, Massimo's dome has a light scaffold around its edges for the builders to stand on. But there's no forest of supporting timber propping up the walls from the ground, and no template to give it its shape. Brunelleschi was a genius. He knew enough geometry to describe the shape of the dome, but how could he get it built? He needed a trick, simple enough to be used by ordinary bricklayers working at perilous heights. The minute positioning of every single brick was vital.
The first important system invented by Brunelleschi was for the substitution of the large centerings, total centerings, with small ones, like these. Obviously, there had to be a trick to do this. Well, the trick is this simple plumb line that I have here. And these two ropes, which in fact are for making this centering vertical.
Servono appunto a far diventare verticale questa centina.
Which in turn is held in place with these hooks that you can see.
Con questi ganci che vedete.
By making sure that the small wooden centerings were correctly aligned, the profile of the dome could be traced in stages. Some experts had suggested similar devices before, but Massimo knew he was still only just beginning to understand Brunelleschi's system. The wooden centering didn't explain how the complicated pattern of bricks could fill the spaces between the corners of the dome. And the angle of these bricks was critical. Too flat, and the geometry wouldn't work. Too steep, and the bricks would fall before the mortar had set. There had to be something more. At last, Massimo discovered Brunelleschi's secret, the most important invention of the dome.
After about 15 years, I managed to build the flower. And from that moment on, it was all a continuous discovery.
A flower. Massimo believes that Brunelleschi drew a pattern of petals where the dome was to spring from the tops of the cathedral walls. This precise mathematical form then became a key to position every single brick in the construction. It's brilliant in its simplicity.
Io ho passato 20 anni della mia vita.
It has taken 20 years of my life to discover this simple metal flower, which solves the dome's construction problems. This is the real secret of the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore.
La cupola di Santa Maria del Fiore. Questo semplice fiore di ferro.
This simple metal flower, which allows such perfect orientation, as you can see, of all these difficult bricks we have here.
Difficili mattoni che si possono vedere. Questo
This simple wire enables the bricklayers to place them so perfectly.
Perfetti.
There would have been no other way of doing it.
altro modo di poterlo fare.
Once the flower pattern is fixed, all you need are ropes, leading from the pattern at one end to the top of the wall on the opposite side. A line is adjusted along the flower until it passes through the center point of the dome. This allows a bricklayer holding the other end of the rope to line up each brick at a slightly different angle, preserving the dome's overall shape. The curve of the walls demonstrates that the flower pattern works. But how could historians be sure that Brunelleschi used the same technique? The search was on for a piece of historical evidence. Was there anything that linked Massimo's flower theory to Brunelleschi's dome? A document in the Florence archives, for centuries thought to be a casual sketch of the dome, was brought to the center of a historical debate.
There are very few bits of visual evidence about the cupola. We know that many, many drawings were produced, but we only have one drawing surviving, and that's this beautiful coloured drawing on parchment by Giovanni di Gherardo da Prato, and what it seems to be is a criticism of what Brunelleschi had done.
Giovanni di Gherardo lo accusa appunto di...
Giovanni de Gherardo accused him of constructing a flawed dome, and he was the person who came closer than anyone else to uncovering the method of its construction. In fact, he drew it in its entirety.
Interamente disegnato.
Despite the fact that this manuscript had been known for 2 centuries, people didn't understand the meaning either of the drawings or of the text. Once again, I was the first to decipher both the drawings and the textual content, because, practically speaking, I had previously found the right path.
Perché praticamente avevo in precedenza trovato la strada giusta.
Massimo thinks that this finally proves his theory. The trouble is that the Gherardo document is such a rough sketch, it can be made to fit almost any idea. So historians remain skeptical, and the mystery of the dome is set to continue.
We've got a happy hunting ground for all kinds of theories. Among them, the kind of theory that can rise out of attempting to replicate what they were doing by building large-scale models of the project itself.
I think a huge amount of progress has actually been made in understanding it in the last 25 years. And it's still going on, and Massimo Ricci's recent work is enormously interesting. But probably there will always be question marks, and this is something that people are going to go on discussing and worrying about for a very long time.
Like the original, Massimo's model will become another tourist site. But it's flimsy evidence for historians. Many people think his ideas are crazy, but Massimo remains convinced that he has truly revealed Brunelleschi's greatest secret.
It's terrific. It's a terrific mystery that I've managed to unravel. I really believe it was my love for Brunelleschi, my love for my city, Florence, and for this monument, which is really, truly universal. It's of universal value. The greatest expression of rationality in architecture that man has ever produced.
But the dome means even more than this to the people of Florence. However Brunelleschi did it, the dome rises above rational engineering. It represents Renaissance invention, but also a Renaissance passion, the ambition of man, confident of their faith in God.
To see the liturgy, to see this octagon full of people who lift songs of praise to God, in whom the transcendence of the human spirit is legible upon their faces, that is finally to understand in modern terms what Brunelleschi conceived in the 15th century.
I think it's difficult to overestimate Brunelleschi's achievement, because by transforming the appearance of Florentine architecture in the 15th century, he really transformed the appearance of the whole of Western architecture in the centuries afterwards.